What does it take for a nation trapped between deserts, glaciers, and the vast Pacific Ocean to rise again and again from near destruction? Chile, one of the most geographically isolated nations on Earth, has always lived at the edge of extremes, its landscape both a barrier and a crucible, shaping a people forged by struggle. Across centuries, settlers, conquerors, rebels, and dreamers have collided with one another and with the land itself, leaving a history as turbulent as the earthquakes that shake its soil. Monte Verde's hunters, Mapuche resistance, wars of independence, and decades of dictatorship. Each era shows Chile's endurance against overwhelming odds. Yet every collapse has been followed by renewal, every defeat by reinvention. From its earliest settlers 12,000 years ago to the fiery protests of the 21st century, Chile's story is a cycle of struggle and rebirth. But what turning points defined its destiny? Around 12,000 BCE, the first groups of people began arriving in what is now Chile, continuing a journey that started thousands of miles away when their ancestors crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Asia into North America. Over generations, families and bands of hunters moved southward, adapting to new environments along the way. By the time they reached the far southern cone of the continent, they encountered landscapes unlike anything most early humans had ever seen. Vast deserts lacking water, dense forests filled with cold rains, mountains that shaped every river valley, and eventually the icy edges of Patagonia. Surviving in such diverse surroundings demanded resilience and ingenuity, and evidence of just how early and adaptive these people were can still be found beneath Chilean soil today. The discovery of the Monte Verde site near Puerto Montt in southern Chile revealed artifacts dating to around 14,500 years ago. This discovery shocked archaeologists because it pushed back the timeline of human habitation in the Americas. Before Monte Verde was uncovered, many researchers believed humans had only entered the continent much later. But here, stone tools, animal remains, and even preserved footprints proved that organized human settlement here existed at one of the earliest known dates in the hemisphere. Remains of wooden structures and evidence of edible plants show that these people were not merely wandering hunters, but had developed seasonal camps suited to their environment. Monte Verde continues to stand as a landmark in archaeology, a place that rewrote our understanding of the earliest chapters of American prehistory. Daily life for these early Chilean inhabitants revolved around hunting and gathering. In the early period, they relied heavily on megafauna, large animals such as mastodons, giant sloths, and early species of ancient camelids. These animals provided not only meat, but hides for shelter and bones for tools. However, as these species disappeared, likely due to a combination of climate change and overhunting, communities shifted to smaller game, fishing, and gathering wild plants. This forced them to craft new tools, adapt to new resources, and refine their techniques for survival. Each ecological region of Chile demanded its own strategies, whether it was finding small oases in the Atacama Desert, netting fish along the long Pacific coastline, or storing food in the wet forests of the south. Geography shaped culture in profound ways. In the north, early groups survived in one of the driest places on Earth, the Atacama Desert. Water was scarce, yet they learned to sustain themselves around small rivers and seasonal rainfall. Because the region is so dry, traces of their camps and tools remain astonishingly intact even today, preserved in the sands with little decay. Moving further south, valleys between the Andes and the coast offered fertile land, where people began experimenting with early farming in addition to hunting. Even more challenging were the southern forests, where dense vegetation, constant rain, and cold winters tested their endurance, but also offered rich resources like fish, shellfish, and medicinal plants. Innovations reflected this adaptability. Stone tools became more specialized, with finely crafted points for hunting smaller animals, and fishing implements made from bone or wood to exploit the coastal bounty. In caves across the region, they left art, paintings and carvings that captured not just survival needs, but cultural expression. These markings remind us that even in harsh conditions, humans carried with them a desire to record, to symbolize, and to share identity. A curious fact is that scientists today use the Atacama Desert to test Mars rovers, precisely because the environment is so dry and barren. It is this same dryness that preserved some of the oldest traces of life in the Americas, making it possible for archaeologists to piece together how Chile's earliest people lived. Their world was filled with both challenges and opportunities, and the solutions they developed laid the foundations for the indigenous cultures that would follow thousands of years later. Before Europeans ever set foot in Chile, the land was home to an extraordinary variety of indigenous societies. In the arid north lived the Atacameño, whose settlements took root in one of the toughest environments on Earth. To survive there, they engineered irrigation channels that carried scarce water from seasonal rivers to their crops. Corn, quinoa, and potatoes grew in small fields carved into valleys, and these harvests allowed them to support not just families, but thriving communities. Their skills in ceramics and textiles point to specified crafts that went beyond simple subsistence. The desert may have looked barren, but the Atacameño built a sustainable life through organization, careful water control, and trade with neighboring groups. Southward, in the central valleys and the temperate forest beyond them, was the land of the Mapuche. Unlike the agricultural communities of the north, the Mapuche were both farmers and warriors. They raised maize and beans in fertile lands, while their social life centered on kinship networks formed around extended families and clans. More importantly, they carried strong traditions of warfare and defense. Leadership often came through the status of skilled fighters, and this value of independence would later shape centuries of conflict with outsiders. The Mapuche mastered the balance between cultivation and readiness for battle. Their villages, called rehui, stood not in isolation but as part of wider alliances that could mobilize quickly when threatened. At the far south, human adaptation took an entirely different form. Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego, and the stormy southern channels supported nomadic groups such as the Chono, Cohuescar, and Yagan peoples. These were maritime cultures, navigating cold seas in canoes built from bark and wood. Wrapped in animal skins to resist wind and rain, they traveled from island to island, living off fish, shellfish, and sea mammals. Fire was constant, carried even in their boats, earning them descriptions as the canoe people. Their entire world was shaped by the waters they traveled, and their knowledge of tides, currents, and storms reflected centuries of accumulated experience. Where agriculture was impossible, survival meant mobility and deep familiarity with the sea. By the late 15th century, another force entered northern Chile, the Inca Empire. Expanding south from Cuzco, the Incas absorbed the Atacama region and parts of central Chile into their realm. Their control was visible in infrastructure. The famous Inca road system, the Capacñan, extended across mountains and deserts into Chilean valleys. Along these roads, tambos, or way stations, were built to house messengers and officials, creating a communication network that stretched from Ecuador all the way to the Maipo Valley. These couriers could carry messages in Quipu code across thousands of kilometers with remarkable speed, linking distant corners of the empire. It is no exaggeration to compare this system to a kind of ancient internet. Information flowed constantly through a web of runners, supply depots, and fortified centers. Yet even the mighty Incas met their limit in the south. The Mapuche resisted campaigns of conquest, holding firm against armies that had overcome so many others across the Andes. Repeated attempts to subdue them ended in stalemate. The Inca pushed their frontier only as far as the Maule River, where they met fierce opposition that could not be broken. This boundary marked not just geography, but identity, an autonomous people who managed to preserve their independence when surrounded by the largest empire in the hemisphere. In this way, the mosaic of cultures across Chile remained intact on the eve of Spanish arrival. Irrigators of the desert, farmers and fighters of fertile plains, and seafaring families of icy waters, each holding knowledge and traditions finely tuned to their part of the world. In 1535, only a few years after the conquest of the Inca Empire, Spanish ambitions turned south towards the lands they called Chile. Diego de Almagro, one of Francisco Pizarro's main partners, gathered an expedition and set out from Cuzco, hoping to find another kingdom rich in precious metals. At that time, Spain's ventures in the Americas were fueled by wealth from places like Mexico and Peru, and leaders assumed that more treasures lay waiting just over the mountains. Almagro's force numbered several hundred Spaniards and included indigenous warriors allied from other regions, along with enslaved men and women brought to assist in the journey. The size of the company reflected not just the ambition of its commander, but also the assumption that a new empire might be conquered in the same fashion as those already subdued. The route south was brutal. Crossing through the Andean passes exposed the group to freezing conditions at high altitude. Snow, lack of food, and thin air drained the strength of both men and animals. Many horses perished on the icy trails, and the soldiers, weighted down by equipment, suffered frostbite and starvation. When the force reached the edge of the Atacama Desert, a different obstacle waited. Water was scarce, vegetation almost non-existent, and the dry climate made every mile a test of endurance. Animals collapsed from thirst, and men struggled to ration what little supplies they had carried. Accounts note that dozens never completed the march, leaving a trail of losses that reduced the company before it even saw the valleys further south. Upon arriving in central Chile, Almagro's contingent expected to uncover cities filled with gold and silver, but the reality was quite different. They encountered indigenous settlements, mostly agricultural communities with fields of maize and beans. The absence of large, centralized states like the Inca meant no stockpiled treasure for the conquistadors to seize. What they did find were fertile lands and rivers that supported villages, but this offered little consolation to Spaniards seeking quick riches. Almagro realized there was no obvious prize to rival Peru, and without enough provisions to maintain his force, he eventually ordered a retreat. This return north was just as deadly as the march down, costing them more lives and leaving many in despair. Despite the failure to secure wealth, the expedition left an important legacy. The soldiers brought back descriptions of central Chile's climate, fertile valleys, and rivers, contrasting with the harsher deserts they had endured. These reports painted a picture of land suitable for farming and settlement. For ambitious conquistadors who thought beyond immediate treasure, this suggested the possibility of stable colonies. Even though Almagro abandoned the idea, the news he carried back ensured that Chile would not be forgotten. One detail that stands out from this first expedition is the composition of the forces. Alongside Spaniards marched enslaved indigenous people taken from other regions, as well as Africans brought from across the Atlantic. This means that, during Almagro's journey, the first Africans likely set foot on Chilean soil, marking the beginning of a long and complex history of African presence in South America. In the end, Almagro's march revealed both the challenges and the potential of Chile. The lack of gold shut down immediate ambitions, but the idea of fertile settlements lingered. This would prove decisive later, when Pedro de Valdivia launched his own campaign to establish a permanent Spanish presence. In 1540, Pedro de Valdivia set out from Peru with a small contingent of soldiers, indigenous auxiliaries, and enslaved individuals, determined to succeed where Diego de Almagro had failed. His ambition was not to chase fleeting treasures, but to plant a permanent colony. Valdivia's vision was unusual among conquistadors of the time. Instead of seeking vast quantities of gold or treasure, he sought fertile ground where Spanish power could take root. After months of travel, his expedition reached the fertile Central Valley of Chile and chose a site at the base of a rocky hill known as Cerro Huelen, later renamed Cerro Santa Lucia. There, in February 1541, the city of Santiago was founded, designed as a Spanish-style settlement with a central plaza, administrative structures, and a series of plots designated for colonists. From the very beginning, Santiago's foundations rested on fragile ground. Unlike Peru or Mexico, there was no great empire to provide tribute or centralized resources. Chile instead offered vast stretches of land inhabited by indigenous communities who had little desire to serve Spanish settlers. Valdivia attempted to distribute land and labor through the encomienda system, but resistance to these demands surfaced almost immediately. Chief among those resisting Spanish encroachment on their lands were the Mapuche, whose traditions of war and independence gave them the experience and motivation to oppose foreign colonization. Their resistance was not confined to skirmishes. It erupted into organized uprisings designed to drive the newcomers out. Only months after Santiago's founding, the fragility of Spanish ambitions was laid bare. A large army of indigenous warriors, led by Michimalonco, launched a devastating attack on the settlement. The assault burned the town to the ground, leaving almost nothing but rubble. For the Spaniards, it was a moment that could have ended their plans altogether, erasing Santiago in its first year. However, the town did not fall completely because its defenders fought with desperation, aware that their survival meant the colony's survival. A central figure in that defense was Inés de Suárez, one of the few Spanish women who had joined the expedition. Accounts describe her role as decisive and brutal. During the crisis, she allegedly executed prisoners held inside the settlement, displaying their severed heads to unnerve the attackers. The act became one of the earliest colonial legends, remembered for both its severity and its effect on morale. Whether every detail of the story is accurate or not, her presence highlights the extraordinary circumstances under which the settlement endured. Santiago's survival did not come from wealth or abundance, but from the sheer determination of a small group unwilling to lose their precarious foothold. In the decades that followed, the Spanish slowly consolidated their position in central Chile, but it remained a frontier society under constant strain. Farms and herds replaced the ashes of Santiago, yet beyond these fragile borders, uprisings erupted repeatedly. The Mapuche in particular launched continual campaigns, raiding settlements, destroying outposts, and keeping the southern frontier in perennial conflict. Spanish governors attempted to stabilize control, yet their authority was always limited by how far they could project power in such hostile terrain. By the end of the 16th century, Spain held on to central Chile, but its frontier to the south was not defined by conquest, but by conflict. Life in the colony meant endurance against a determined indigenous resistance, a constant reminder that Spain's grasp was never absolute. By the 17th century, Chile had shifted from the desperate struggles of its founding years into a colony that was stable enough to endure, but poor compared to Spain's other possessions. The mineral wealth that had transformed Mexico and Peru into vital centers of the empire did not exist in Chile. Instead, its economy rested on the soil, with agriculture and cattle raising providing the backbone of colonial life. Farms around Santiago and along the central valleys produced wheat, wine, and livestock in large quantities. These products were carried north to supply Peru, where the silver mines of Potosí demanded constant food shipments to feed tens of thousands of miners and their families. It was in this role that Chile carved out its importance, less as a source of treasure and more as a distant granary for the empire. Spanish settlers in the Central Valley established large estates called estancias, which became the centers of agricultural production. Wheat was milled in small towns and packaged for mule trains that connected Chile with the markets of Peru. Wine production, too, began to expand, with vineyards planted along river valleys that offered suitable soil. In time, Chilean wines would even compete with those of Spain in colonial markets, demonstrating an early specialty of the region. Cattle raising also occupied large pastures, providing leather and tallow for trade. With little urban industry, these rural estates defined economic life, and a small elite of landowners emerged from their profits. Even while central lands were consolidated, the South remained locked in struggle. The Mapuche had not been defeated, and they continued their campaigns to resist Spanish encroachment. For more than 100 years, a shifting frontier line divided Spanish-controlled territory from Mapuche strongholds. Forts rose along the Biobío River and beyond, and colonial garrisons manned them, but they faced regular uprisings, raids, and attacks. Every Spanish attempt to push deep into Mapuche lands sparked new rounds of fighting. The South, therefore, remained unconquered, and its autonomy stood out within a continent where most major indigenous centers fell under Spanish control. Colonial society in Chile was built upon a hierarchy that reflected wider patterns of Spanish rule. At the top stood the Spanish-born elite and their descendants, who owned land and dominated political positions. Below them were mestizos, people of mixed ancestry, who grew in number and often filled roles as laborers, artisans, and soldiers. Indigenous communities were pushed into labor systems tied to encomiendas, supplying work for fields and estates. A small enslaved African population added another layer, present in households, workshops, and rural estates. Though their numbers never reached the levels of places like Brazil, Africans formed a distinct community within Chile, contributing to its workforce and cultures in ways often overlooked. The Catholic Church extended its reach during this century. Missions spread into indigenous areas in hopes of conversion, while schools attached to religious orders trained local elites. Churches rose in towns and villages, serving not only as religious centers but also as symbols of Spanish authority. The church became a major landholder and helped shape local governance through its influence on both education and law. Life in Chile was also defined by instability brought by nature and threats from the sea. Earthquakes shook towns repeatedly, undoing years of building and reminding colonists of the fragility of their settlements. Tsunamis battered coastal communities, and pirate raids disrupted trade, forcing governors to maintain defenses they could scarcely afford. In 1647, disaster struck Santiago in particular when a massive earthquake reduced most of the city to rubble, killing about a third of its people. Despite suggestions that the site was too dangerous, Santiago was rebuilt almost exactly where it had stood, demonstrating both the attachment to the valley and the determination of its inhabitants. Throughout the 17th century, Chile survived not through riches, but through resilience. It remained a colony on the margins of empire, but one whose agricultural lifeline made it indispensable to the larger Spanish world. By the 18th century, Chile stood out in the Spanish Empire as a society that looked both stable and unsettled at the same time. The fertile valleys around Santiago and Concepcion produced steady harvests, and the colonial cities of central Chile functioned as typical Spanish towns, with churches, marketplaces, and municipal councils. Yet to the south, the frontier with the Mapuche was in constant turmoil. No other region in Spanish America presented such a stubborn obstacle to imperial expansion. Beyond the Biobío River, the Mapuche resisted through a mixture of raids, battles, and negotiation that shaped centuries of history. Chile was not a land of gold or silver mines. It was a land defined by a moving border, where Spanish authority stopped and indigenous autonomy began. At the heart of this dynamic was the conflict known as the Arauco War. Unlike a single campaign with a clear end, this was a long series of confrontations stretching across generations. Spanish soldiers established forts along the frontier, trying to secure pastures and roads, but these outposts came under constant attack. Mapuche fighters would strike quickly and retreat into terrain that suited their mobility. Settlers living near the frontier never knew when a raid might strip them of crops or livestock. Entire towns were sometimes abandoned in waves of unrest. For the colonial government, the South became a zone of endless expense, requiring troops and resources that barely produced lasting victories. What made Chile different from many other colonies was the way Spain eventually treated this conflict. Rather than attempting total conquest, colonial authorities relied on parlamentos, formal meetings where Spanish governors and Mapuche leaders debated terms of peace. These gatherings often resembled diplomatic ceremonies, with rituals of feasting, speeches, and the exchange of gifts. Through these talks, maps of influence were drawn. The Spanish recognized that south of the Biobío River, they held no permanent control. It was effectively an acknowledgement of Mapuche sovereignty, something rare in the Spanish world. These meetings reduced open conflict for periods of time, but never ended the violence entirely. While the southern frontier defined military and political life, central Chile was evolving into a society concentrated around agriculture. Large estates, known as haciendas, grew in number. They were owned by a handful of powerful families whose influence extended into politics, the church, and municipal councils. On these estates, indigenous laborers, mestizos, and enslaved people raised the wheat, cattle, and wine that supported the colony's economy. With little mineral wealth to export, agriculture and ranching were the foundation of everyday life, and land ownership became the main source of social prestige. The Mapuche, meanwhile, did not remain fixed in their traditional ways. They integrated European tools, horses, and iron weapons into their own culture of resistance. Horses, in particular, transformed their military role. By the 18th century, Mapuche cavalry fighters had a reputation for speed and effectiveness, often surpassing their colonial counterparts in mobility and skill. Iron-tipped lances, stolen or traded from Spanish sources, gave them an added advantage. These adaptations meant that, even after centuries of conflict, the Mapuche were not a people crushed by invasion, but a society reshaped and strengthened through selective adoption of outside elements. Thus, on the eve of the 19th century, Chile remained a frontier colony, its identity tied as much to grain fields and vineyards as to the unresolved struggle with the indigenous South. The rhythm of its history was the rhythm of negotiation, resistance, and uneasy coexistence. In 1808, the European balance of power shifted dramatically when Napoleon invaded Spain and forced the abdication of King Ferdinand VII. The Spanish crown, which had controlled vast lands across the Americas for centuries, suddenly looked fragile. Rule passed into the hands of French authorities in Europe, while loyalist Spanish juntas popped up in exile to claim legitimacy. For Spain's colonies, this sparked a crisis. Who exactly held authority? The French-backed king, the imprisoned Ferdinand, or the local representatives in Spain? That uncertainty resonated across Latin America and opened the door for local leaders to question whether they needed Spanish direction at all. In Chile, the leading voices in this moment came from Creole elites, locally born Spaniards who had long lived beneath the authority of officials sent from Europe. These men had wealth and influence but were often locked out of the highest government offices, which were reserved for Spaniards born in the Iberian Peninsula. With Madrid itself occupied and the monarchy disrupted, the Creoles began discussing autonomy. At first, their rhetoric was cautious. Most declared loyalty to the rightful king, Ferdinand, arguing only for self-government until he returned. This balancing act reflected the uncertainty of the time. Moderates sought to protect their privileges without risking accusations of outright rebellion. Momentum gathered quickly. Debates across Santiago's town councils questioned if loyalty to Spain truly meant obedience to French-backed officials. On September 18, 1810, leaders called an open meeting and proclaimed the first national government junta. It was a local governing body created in the name of King Ferdinand, not a declaration of independence, but in hindsight, later generations remembered that date as Chile's symbolic birth as a nation. The junta took control of political decisions, formed local militias, and organized new elections. Suddenly, authority rested more in Santiago than Madrid. Yet this new form of self-government exposed deep fractures within Chilean society. Moderates favored small reforms, continuing to view Spain as their broader protective framework. They saw their loyalty as temporary but real, believing in gradual change until the European crisis ended. Radicals, however, saw the chance for full independence. For them, the disruption in Spain proved that Chile's destiny lay outside foreign control altogether. Over the next few years, these differing visions sparked bitter quarrels inside the fledgling government, with each side accusing the other of threatening stability. Spain, regaining its strength, soon reacted. Royal officials and loyalists within Chile mobilized to reverse the move towards self-rule. Skirmishes broke out as royalist forces opposed patriotic militias raised by the junta. While not yet a full revolutionary war, these early clashes revealed that the debate over autonomy would not remain confined to words or pamphlets. It became a matter of arms. One of the central figures in these years was José Miguel Carrera. Young and charismatic, Carrera seized power in 1811 and used his position to push Chile further toward independence. Under his leadership, symbols of national identity began to emerge. In 1812, he introduced Chile's first national flag, distinct from Spain's banners. New emblems and publications carried patriotic messages, signaling to the wider population that a separate Chilean identity was forming. A curious cultural note from this period was Chile's first national anthem, written to celebrate the spirit of independence during these years. Rare among nations, however, Chile did not keep its first anthem permanently. Decades later, it was replaced with the version still used today, leaving behind an early reminder of the shifting identity that marked Chile's turbulent beginnings. In 1814, the fragile independence movement of Chile suffered a crushing setback. Patriot forces had been organizing their defenses against Spanish troops, but at the Battle of Rancagua, they faced a decisive defeat. Royalist forces laid siege to the small town where Patriot fighters led by Bernardo O'Higgins made a desperate last stand. Surrounded and outnumbered, the Patriots fought until their ammunition and provisions ran out. When the defenders could no longer hold the lines, chaos swept through the ranks. The defeat forced O'Higgins and other leaders to retreat north, but the danger did not end in Chile. Instead, they were driven across the Andes, seeking refuge in Argentina alongside other exiled revolutionaries. With the fall of Rancagua, the independence experiment collapsed, and the territory returned once again to Spanish control. The years that followed became known as the Reconquista, when loyalist authorities reasserted their grip over Chile. Repression became standard policy. Known revolutionaries were executed or exiled, their property confiscated, and their communities placed under close surveillance. Royalist officials worked to extinguish any sign of the early movement, imposing strict censorship and restoring colonial hierarchy. Villages that had shown sympathy for patriotic leaders came under punitive measures, and imprisonment or forced labor awaited many who were accused of aiding rebellion. For ordinary people, the Reconquista meant the atmosphere of suspicion and fear typical of a colony in crisis, where association with the independence cause could lead to ruin. Yet exile across the Andes offered patriots not only safety, but also a chance to regroup. Argentina itself had launched its independence struggle, and in Mendoza, a partnership emerged between José de San Martín, a skilled military organizer from the Rio de la Plata, and Bernardo O'Higgins, the Chilean leader who had escaped destruction at Rancagua. Together, they envisioned not a narrow Chilean revolt, but a wider campaign to secure independence throughout the southern continent. The Army of the Andes grew out of this vision, an army deliberately trained and supplied to break through the mountain barrier and liberate Chile. The plan required one of the most ambitious military maneuvers attempted in the Americas. In early 1817, thousands of soldiers began the march through the Andes. The mountains stretched over 20,000 feet high, with freezing conditions, thin oxygen, and snowbound passes. Soldiers carried their equipment and supplies along narrow trails, driving pack animals laden with artillery over icy paths. Desertion and death from exposure were constant risks, yet the army pressed forward with determination. Historians often compare this feat with Hannibal's crossing of the Alps or Napoleon's efforts in Europe. For South America, however, the Andes crossing was a turning point that matched any of those legendary marches in scale and consequence. When the Army of the Andes finally descended into Chilean territory, its arrival shifted the balance of power. In February 1817, San Martín and O'Higgins confronted Royalist forces at the Battle of Chacabuco. The Patriots gained a clear victory, opening the way to Santiago and reviving the independence movement that seemed crushed only 3 years before. O'Higgins assumed the role of Supreme Director, leading with the renewed momentum of military success and political authority. The Spanish attempted to restore their dominance, but the decisive confrontation came in April 1818 at the Battle of Maipú. Here, the Patriot forces secured a comprehensive victory over Loyalist troops. The Royalist army collapsed, and with it, the hope of Spain reclaiming the colony. From this point forward, Chile stood not as a rebellious territory, but as an independent republic. A revealing detail from the Andes campaign highlights the fusion of warfare and ideology. Among the heavy supplies carried over the mountains was a small, portable printing press. With it, the Patriots produced pamphlets and proclamations, spreading revolutionary messages to local populations as they advanced. This early use of mobile propaganda demonstrated that the struggle was not only fought with weapons, but with ideas, and each was crucial to securing Chile's future. Victory at Maipú in 1818 secured independence on paper, but the new republic soon realized that large royalist outposts still held strong positions in the south and along the Pacific coast. The Spanish presence in these areas continued to pose a serious threat, since well-defended garrisons could act as jumping-off points for counterattacks. Southern forts and ports remained stubbornly loyal to the crown, and their presence weakened Chile's claim to full independence. Ensuring survival meant taking the fight beyond the central valleys into the sea and distant coastal enclaves. The Navy became central to this mission. The government turned to a British officer, Lord Thomas Cochrane, whose career in Europe had marked him as a daring seaman and relentless reformer. When he arrived in Chile, the fleet was small and disorganized, barely able to compete with the stronger royalist ships protecting Peru and southern Chile. Cochrane set about creating a disciplined navy. He trained sailors in modern tactics, improved the ships with whatever resources the country could provide, and instilled in his crews a reputation for aggression. With these measures, Chile was no longer limited to defending its shores, but could actively contest Spanish naval control of the Pacific. The most striking demonstration of this new naval power came in 1820. Valdivia, one of Spain's most heavily fortified bases in the Americas, sat on Chile's southern coast. Its harbor and surrounding defenses made it nearly impossible to seize through conventional assault. Cochrane assembled a small force for a surprise landing. Under cover of night, they captured a royalist outpost and used the element of shock to storm the remaining positions one by one. Within days, Valdivia fell. That victory not only eliminated one of the last major Spanish bulwarks, but also gave the young republic control of a key harbor. The fall of Valdivia carried disproportionate importance, for it revealed that persistence and inventive strategy could overcome Spain's superior fortifications. O'Higgins and Cochrane did not limit the struggle to Chile. Both saw liberation as a regional task and organized expeditions to Peru, the core of remaining Spanish strength in South America. In 1820 and 1821, Chilean ships transported soldiers northward to assist José de San Martin's campaign against Lima. Chilean crews blockaded ports, raided supplies, and disrupted communications, forcing Spain to divide its resources across a vast territory. By pushing the front into Peru, Chile ensured that the fight would not circle back into its heartland. Even after these achievements, one more royalist stronghold remained. Chiloé Island, located off the southern coast, continued to resist well into the decade. Its isolation and fortifications made it difficult to attack. Successive campaigns struggled against the logistical challenges of reaching and supplying forces in the region. Finally, in 1826, after negotiations and military pressure, Spanish defenders on Chiloé surrendered. With that, colonial rule formally ended across Chilean territory. Despite victory, the Republic faced immense difficulties. Years of warfare left the economy drained. Rival political factions quarreled over the direction of the new state, while rebuilding infrastructure and ensuring stability challenged even the most capable leaders. Independence created freedom, but also exposed divisions that would shape politics for decades. One story from Cochrane captures the spirit of ingenuity in these campaigns. To intimidate a larger royalist contingent, he once disguised a single vessel with painted wooden cannons and dummies arranged as soldiers on deck. The ruse convinced the enemy that they faced a fleet, prompting retreat. This deception, simple but effective, emphasized the creativity that often turned the balance during Chile's War of Consolidation. The years after Chile's final break with Spain were far from a period of peace. Between 1826 and 1833, the new republic found itself in constant turmoil. Leaders had dreamed of stability after decades of fighting, but instead, the country slid into years of weak governments and shifting coalitions. Few administrations lasted very long, and rules of governance kept changing. Constitutions were written and discarded within months, and political experiments piled up so quickly that citizens had little chance of adjusting before another reform replaced them. What should have been the consolidation of independence instead became another struggle, not against Spain this time, but among Chileans themselves. At the heart of the instability lay a stark division between centralists and federalists. Centralists believed Chile needed a strong, unified authority based in Santiago, one capable of holding together its fragile institutions and directing policy with certainty. Federalists pushed the opposite idea, arguing for regional autonomy, where provinces could manage their own affairs. This tug-of-war was more than a theoretical debate, since it shaped how power and taxes were distributed in a country with regional economies and loyalties. Each faction feared the other's triumph would destroy the republic, and so neither side yielded easily. Because of these conflicts, presidents often held office for only a short time before resigning, or being forced out, or replaced through political maneuvering. Ramón Freire, for example, rose to prominence as one of the key caudillos of the period. Caudillos were military men who blended political power with their control of armed supporters. During the Wars of Independence, figures like the Carrera brothers had already shown how strong personal leadership could topple opponents. After 1826, this model continued. Freire came to dominate national politics, but could not establish lasting unity, and rival generals or regional figures constantly opposed him. The army, rather than remaining subordinate to civilian order, became a regular actor in government change. The fragility of the situation was compounded by Chile's financial troubles. Years of battles against Spain had left the treasury drained. The Navy, so central to the final victories against royalist strongholds, cost enormous sums to sustain, but without it, Chile risked exposure at sea. Paying soldiers, maintaining fortifications, and servicing war debts often exceeded what the economy could provide. The government raised loans, but creditors soon grew wary of unstable administrations unable to guarantee repayment. Economic exhaustion fed back into politics, since underfunded governments lost legitimacy and found themselves even more vulnerable to being replaced. The uncertainty had such depth that leaders sometimes searched for radical alternatives. One proposal actually suggested installing a foreign monarch in Chile to impose order from above. Among those considered was a French prince, a plan that went as far as exploratory discussions. While it never materialized, the idea itself reflected how desperate some elites had become. They no longer trusted homegrown institutions to provide stability. Instead, they hoped to borrow legitimacy from Europe, much as Spanish rule once had. By 1833, the experiment of loosely defined republicanism had exhausted itself. Elite factions began to argue that only a strong constitutional framework, with centralized authority capable of restraining caudillos and guaranteeing order, could end the chaos. What followed was a turn toward a much more rigid and authoritative form of governance, one that would dominate Chilean politics for decades and move the nation away from the instability of its first years. The Constitution of 1833 marked a turning point in Chile's political life. It was crafted to end the instability of the previous decade, when governments rose and fell in quick succession. The new system concentrated power in the central state. At its core, the presidency became the dominant institution. The office was designed with wide-ranging authority, not just to enforce laws, but to influence nearly every branch of government. Presidents had control over the army, the treasury, and even strong sway in appointing judges and provincial officials. Elections existed, but only a small fraction of the population could participate. Property requirements, literacy qualifications, and other barriers kept most citizens excluded from the vote. In practice, democratic representation was narrow, while executive power was immense. Despite its authoritarian tone, this framework brought an element Chile had lacked since independence: stability. Political elites, especially those aligned with conservative ideals, supported the system because it gave them an organized state under their control. The state no longer fractured every few years over competing visions, and the conservative order endured through decades of governance. The man most closely tied to this arrangement was Diego Portales. Though never president, he shaped its foundations through sheer influence. Portales believed strong authority and discipline were necessary for national progress. His assassination in 1837 did not undo his impact. The political rules he promoted continued to dominate even after his death, and his vision guided the leaders who followed. Among those leaders were Manuel Bulnes and later Manuel Montt, two presidents who embodied the era's emphasis on centralized power. Under Bulnes, Chile emerged from internal divisions with a strengthened military and a government run firmly from the capital. Montt pushed administrative reforms and used his authority to expand the reach of the state even further. Both figures benefited from the groundwork laid by the 1833 Constitution and proved how effective the model could be at consolidating control. Their administrations stood in contrast to the loose, shifting coalitions that had plagued Chile in the 1820s. Institutional growth was a hallmark of this period. The Chilean army, once a fragmented force of warlords and militias, grew into a professional institution loyal to the central state. The bureaucracy expanded, creating a framework of civil servants to support the executive branch. The Catholic Church, already powerful in social life, secured an enduring role as a partner of the government, not just in religion, but also in education and moral oversight. This trio, army, bureaucracy, and church, formed the backbone of the conservative order and provided the consistency that the political class demanded. The broader economy also began to rebound. Exports became the lifeline of national finance. Wheat fields in the Central Valleys produced a surplus not only for domestic needs, but for foreign markets. During the California gold rush in the mid-19th century, miners across the Pacific bought Chilean wheat in enormous quantities, linking the country to booming trade networks. Copper and silver also left Chilean ports, creating steady income for those in power. With stable government and profitable trade, infrastructure began to grow. Roads improved, schools were founded, and the capital gained new importance as the country's administrative heart. Yet these successes rested on exclusion. The press faced restrictions, opposition voices were silenced, and critics of the regime risked exile or arrest. Chile's emerging stability came at the price of limited political freedoms. The country moved forward in economics and education, but its political life remained tightly controlled by the few at the top. By the mid-19th century, Chile had grown into a relatively stable republic, but its leaders looked beyond consolidation in Santiago and Valparaiso. The government sought to extend authority over territories that had remained outside of colonial or national control. This period, stretching from the 1860s to the late 1870s, was defined by a drive to expand state borders, strengthen the army, and absorb lands that had long resisted both Spanish and early Republican influence. Expansion not only promised more farmland and resources, but also aimed to project state authority into regions where central control had always been tenuous. One of the main objectives was the South, where Mapuche communities still held autonomy across vast areas. For centuries, they had resisted Spanish conquest, forcing colonial authorities to recognize their independence through treaties. That balance, however, shifted as the Chilean state grew stronger. Starting in the 1860s, officials in Santiago launched what became known as the occupation of Araucanía. Military expeditions moved steadily into Mapuche territory, constructing forts, confiscating land, and bringing new settlers into the region. The process was gradual, consisting of battles, raids, and negotiations, but its direction was clear. The state intended to impose control regardless of local resistance. Government leaders portrayed these campaigns as a pacification, suggesting a civilizing mission, yet the reality on the ground was far harsher. Mapuche families were displaced from fertile valleys, and lands once held collectively were divided up for agricultural production and private enterprise. Many indigenous communities, deprived of their territories, faced economic decline and growing marginalization within their own homeland. Over time, settlers occupied what had once been Mapuche space, reshaping not only the economy of the South, but also its demographic balance. Alongside soldiers, immigrants played a central role in this project. To populate the occupied lands, the state promoted European settlement, offering incentives for families willing to relocate to the southern frontier. German migrants in particular arrived in significant numbers, founding towns, opening businesses, and introducing farming techniques that suited the damp climate of the region. Their influence extended beyond agriculture, as they also brought cultural practices that became part of Chilean life. One of the more lasting contributions was beer brewing, which took root in these communities and would eventually give rise to a widespread national culture around beer consumption. At the same time, Chile looked northward. Though the deserts seemed barren, they lay adjacent to Bolivia and Peru in areas that would soon reveal immense deposits of nitrates. Before the wars that erupted over these resources, the Chilean government pursued treaties to define these boundaries. These agreements temporarily kept peace, but they reflected Chile's growing recognition that its northern frontier would one day be contested. Strengthening claims there became as important as consolidating the land taken from the Mapuche in the south. The army proved crucial in these processes. Years of organizing campaigns in Araucanía enhanced its discipline and professionalism. Officers gained field experience in skirmishes and long expeditions across rugged landscapes. This training hardened Chile's military, leaving it better prepared for the larger battles to come. Within a few years, this experience would prove essential as Chile's forces confronted neighboring states in one of the most significant conflicts of the 19th century, the War of the Pacific. In 1879, Chile entered a conflict that would reshape the map of South America. The war began over control of the Atacama Desert, a region that seemed inhospitable but held vast deposits of nitrates. These natural compounds, essential for producing fertilizer and explosives, had become one of the most valuable resources in the world. Bolivia controlled much of the area, and Peru maintained interests through companies operating there. When Bolivia attempted to increase taxes on Chilean mining firms, Chile responded by occupying a Bolivian port city, triggering the start of the war. Peru was drawn into the conflict through a secret defensive alliance with Bolivia, lining up a regional contest over raw materials, trade, and strategic dominance. The economic stakes were enormous. During the 19th century, nitrates were in high demand across Europe and North America. Before synthetic chemicals replaced them, nitrate shipments fueled agriculture and armed nations alike. Whoever controlled this trade controlled wealth and influence far beyond South America. Chile, though smaller in population than its adversaries, had built a stronger economy and a more organized state, giving it an advantage once fighting began. Leaders in Santiago understood that victory would mean not only national survival, but also financial security tied directly to the desert's mineral riches. A critical factor in Chile's success was its navy. Unlike Peru and Bolivia, Chile had made large investments in steam-powered vessels and modern armaments. Early in the war, naval clashes demonstrated how decisive sea power would be. The most famous encounter came during the Battle of Iquique in 1879. Chilean commander Arturo Prat boarded the Peruvian ironclad Huáscar in a daring but doomed attack. His death turned him into a national hero, inspiring Chileans with an image of sacrifice and patriotism. Soon after, the Chilean fleet managed to capture the Huáscar, removing Peru's strongest ship from the fight and giving Chile effective control of the coast. With the oceans secure, Chile could move troops and supplies with relative ease. Campaigns shifted to land, where Chilean forces advanced through arid deserts and harsh terrain. Battles were fought in conditions where thirst and exhaustion were as deadly as bullets. Yet the army, already experienced from operations in Araucanía, proved disciplined and capable. Over time, Chilean units pushed north, and in 1881 they marched into Lima itself. Occupying the capital of Peru marked an extraordinary achievement, one that underscored how a smaller state, through organization and naval strength, could overcome larger neighbors. The war formally ended with negotiations that redrew borders. Chile annexed territories from both Peru and Bolivia, gaining provinces rich in nitrates that would fund the state for decades. For Bolivia, the loss was particularly devastating. The country surrendered its entire coastline, becoming permanently landlocked. This outcome shaped its national identity and remains a matter of grievance more than a century later. Peru lost valuable ground and endured long-term economic consequences. By contrast, Chile secured the resources that transformed its treasury and positioned it as a regional power for the rest of the century. The legacy of the war is still active. In Bolivia, each year a national ceremony known as the Dia del Mar, or Day of the Sea, commemorates the lost coastline and calls attention to its maritime aspirations. For Chile, the memory of figures like Arturo Prat and the spoils of victory became symbols of unity and ambition during a period when the nation sought lasting strength. By the late 1880s, the balance of power in Chile came under extraordinary strain. President José Manuel Balmaceda, elected in 1886, was determined to expand the role of the executive branch. He believed that a strong presidency was essential for modernization, and he set out on an ambitious program of reform. Under his administration, new railways extended deep into the interior, schools multiplied, and public works projects sought to tie the nation together with modern infrastructure. Balmaceda envisioned Chile as more than just a raw material exporter. He wanted it to become an organized, advanced republic with the state firmly in control of growth. Yet these efforts collided with Congress, which had long been dominated by the conservative oligarchy. Wealthy landowners and influential elites saw Balmaceda's vision as a direct challenge to their dominance. The dispute began primarily over the national budget. Balmaceda insisted that control of revenues, especially the vast nitrate income from Chile's northern provinces, should rest with the executive. Congress, however, was unwilling to yield financial authority. Each side accused the other of trampling the Constitution, and the legislative-executive standoff deepened. In response to repeated refusals from Congress, Balmaceda announced that he would govern without their approval. What began as a political quarrel escalated into an open confrontation that shook the institutional order established since 1833. In January 1891, matters exploded into open civil war. The Navy, with its powerful fleet, declared loyalty to Congress. This handed the legislature control of the seas and international trade routes. The Army, meanwhile, was split. Some units remained loyal to Balmaceda, while others sided with his opponents, creating a conflict in which entire provinces were forced to choose allegiance. The resulting struggle was not a quick uprising, but a lengthy and bloody war. Key battles unfolded across the north and center of the country, with both sides mobilizing thousands of troops. Railways and telegraph lines became tools of war, moving soldiers and relaying crucial information at speeds unimaginable just decades earlier. The decisive engagements came in the later stages of 1891. In August, after months of stalemate, the congressional forces gained the upper hand. At battles near Concón and Placilla, Balmaceda's troops were overwhelmed. These defeats left his government in collapse, and within weeks, congressional armies entered Santiago to claim victory. Facing inevitable arrest and humiliation, Balmaceda took his own life on September 19, 1891, the very day his constitutional term as president was meant to end. His suicide marked one of the most dramatic conclusions to a presidency in Chilean history, highlighting just how far the conflict had torn apart political life. What emerged after the war was not a return to presidential dominance, but instead a parliamentary-style republic. Congress secured sweeping powers at the expense of the executive. From then on, Chile's presidents were constrained and often little more than ceremonial heads, while real decision-making lay with legislators and the wealthy oligarchy behind them. Political participation for ordinary citizens remained minimal, as property ownership and social class continued to dictate access to representation. One small but fascinating episode of the conflict involved Chile's financial reserves. To prevent congressional forces from seizing them, Balmaceda deposited the majority of the treasury's gold in the U.S. Embassy. Remarkably, once the war ended, the gold was returned intact, making it one of the rare cases where such a move succeeded without sparking international scandal. It remains a curious symbol of how desperate and extraordinary the times had become. After the bloody end of Balmaceda's presidency, Chile entered a political experiment that historians often label the Parliamentary Republic. Although the system carried the name, it was very different from the parliamentary models that existed in Europe. In theory, Chile had tilted power toward Congress at the expense of the executive, leaving presidents weak and unable to impose their will. They became administrators rather than leaders, with cabinets rising and falling depending on congressional support. In practice, governments were rarely stable, party coalitions were fragile, and without the kind of strong party discipline found in places like Britain, cabinets often lasted only for a short time before breaking apart. This gave Chile a reputation for political gridlock, even while the framework survived for more than 3 decades. Behind the institutions, the real power rested with a small group of oligarchic elites. Wealthy landowners, merchants, and nitrate magnates controlled parliamentary seats and influenced legislation. Elections were held but carefully managed. Voting restrictions tied participation to property and literacy, keeping large sections of the population outside the political process. The upper class saw no need to change this arrangement, since it guaranteed their dominance while maintaining the appearance of constitutional rule. For ordinary Chileans, political influence was out of reach. Local bosses, family dynasties, and patronage networks shaped outcomes more than democratic choice. Even so, the economy under this system experienced enormous growth. The The nitrate boom provided Chile with steady revenues, especially as European agriculture relied heavily on the mineral to boost productivity. In the northern desert, new towns sprang up almost overnight around nitrate offices and ports. Valparaiso and other coastal hubs became gateways for this trade, while Santiago absorbed state revenue flowing in from customs and export taxes. For decades, nitrates carried the Chilean economy almost single-handedly. But with prosperity came dependence, as few leaders seriously pursued diversification. The wealth concentrated in the hands of the elite, who invested profits back into estate lands and urban projects rather than broad social improvements. The contrast between economic wealth and political exclusion led to rising unrest across the working population. Miners in the nitrate fields faced dangerous conditions, low wages, and company control over their housing and stores. Industrial laborers in the growing cities met similar hardships. Peasants tied to large estates saw little benefit from modern reforms, as traditional hierarchies kept them bound to landlords. By the early 20th century, these groups began organizing, often inspired by labor movements abroad. Strikes, protests, and demands for recognition became more common, signaling that beneath Chile's parliamentary facade, the social order was increasingly fragile. The state's response was often violent. In 1907, one of the most infamous episodes unfolded in the port city of Iquique. Thousands of striking nitrate miners and their families had gathered at the Santa Maria school to demand better pay and conditions. The army surrounded the site and opened fire, killing hundreds in what became known as the Santa Maria School Massacre. The event shocked observers and remains a stark reminder of how far the establishment was willing to go to defend its authority. For workers, it hardened the conviction that the political order was designed against them. Curiously, this period also saw Chile become one of the most literate nations in Latin America. Schools expanded, newspapers circulated widely, and intellectual culture flourished. Yet literacy did not translate into citizenship rights. Many could read and debate ideas, but remained voiceless in elections. That contradiction defined much of the Parliamentary Republic, a society growing more modern, yet trapped in an outdated political system that postponed true democratic participation. The year 1925 marked the introduction of a new constitution that reshaped Chile's political order. After more than 3 decades of congressional control under the Parliamentary Republic, the system was widely seen as outdated and incapable of addressing the social demands of a growing urban population. The Constitution restored the central role of the presidency, giving the executive branch broad powers over legislation, the military, and state administration. This shift ended the dominance of Congress and was meant to bring stronger leadership to a country grappling with political unrest and deep social inequalities. The presidency was positioned not as a ceremonial post, but as the central authority in national life once again. One of the key figures in this transformation was Arturo Alessandri. Known as the Lion of Tarapacá, he had already pushed for reform during his earlier time in office. With the new constitution behind him, Alessandri sought to modernize Chile by introducing measures that responded to workers, the middle class, and the growing urban population. His agenda included labor protections, the strengthening of unions, and the creation of a social security system. Education received new attention, with more schools open to serve a society that was increasingly literate but still unequal. Alessandri's leadership reflected the larger trend of the state becoming an active force in social and economic matters, rather than leaving progress solely in the hands of landowners and private business elites. Despite these reforms, stability was not immediate. The military continued to show its presence in politics, especially during the 1920s and 1930s. Coups, interventions, and short-lived juntas interrupted constitutional governance. At times, military leaders sought to impose their own policies, reflecting tensions between an emerging civilian democracy and armed forces that had grown in prestige after past wars. The instability highlighted how fragile the new constitutional order remained in its early decades. Over time, however, civilian rule regained consistency, and the military settled into a background role, although its influence never fully disappeared from Chilean politics. Economically, Chile began an effort to diversify away from nitrate exports, which had collapsed after synthetic alternatives emerged in Europe. This crisis showed the dangers of dependence on a single resource. As a result, governments placed new emphasis on industrialization and state-led development. Public corporations were established, and tariffs encouraged domestic production of goods that had previously been imported. Agricultural modernization accompanied this shift, but it was industry in cities such as Santiago that became the symbol of change. Still, Chile remained vulnerable to global market swings, particularly during the Great Depression, when unemployment and poverty spread rapidly despite industrial policies. The political scene also reflected profound change. New forces entered the mainstream, most notably socialist and communist parties, which drew support from organized workers and urban middle classes. Their presence in elections and influence in labor conflicts shifted Chile's politics away from the exclusive control of oligarchic elites. For the first time, workers, teachers, and lower-income groups had formal representation within institutions, even if progress was uneven and often resisted by conservative sectors. Social policy expanded steadily throughout this era. Labor laws guaranteed improved working hours and protections, public education spread to more regions, and early forms of welfare created a foundation for later reforms. The state positioned itself as a mediator between capital and labor, reflecting an effort to balance modernization with social peace. A lesser-known but notable achievement was the founding of Latin America's first state-run airline in 1929. Known then as Línea Aérea Nacional, it began with only 2 planes serving domestic routes. Over time, it grew into what is today LATAM, one of the largest airlines on the continent, symbolizing Chile's effort to integrate itself not only internally, but also into global networks of commerce and travel. In 1970, Chile entered a moment unlike anything it had seen before. Salvador Allende, a physician and longtime socialist politician, won the presidency at the head of the Unidad Popular coalition. His rise was historic not only for Chile, but for the world, since no other country had ever chosen a Marxist president through an open democratic election. Supporters celebrated the result as proof that sweeping social transformation could come through ballots rather than violence. The Unidad Popular Alliance, composed of socialists, communists, radicals, and other leftist parties, now carried the responsibility of reshaping Chile's future. Allende's vision was radical in scope. He believed Chile could move towards socialism while preserving democratic institutions. His government began with decisive steps. The copper industry, long the backbone of Chile's economy but dominated by U.S.-owned companies, was nationalized. These new state enterprises provided the government with direct earnings, funding programs for education, healthcare, and housing. Land reform also accelerated. Large estates were broken up, and land redistributed to peasants who had historically worked under landlord control. Alongside this, the administration sought to expand social services for workers, raising wages, freezing certain prices, and extending access to basic goods. These reforms transformed daily life for many Chileans. Supporters embraced the idea that at last, workers, miners, and the poor majority were no longer excluded. Factories saw workers' committees emerge, communities organized new cultural programs, and a sense of empowerment grew in neighborhoods that had often been left behind. Yet alongside this enthusiasm came sharp divisions. Many members of the middle and upper classes recoiled from the government's measures. They saw their property seized, their businesses regulated, and their privileges questioned. Political opponents charged that Allende's program threatened to push Chile into a dictatorship under the banner of socialism. The opposition extended far beyond Chile's borders. The United States government viewed Allende's rise with deep alarm, fearing that a socialist success in Latin America could set an example during the Cold War. Washington cut aid, discouraged trade, and supported opposition groups inside Chile. These pressures added strain to an already fragile economy. By the early 1970s, shortages of basic goods became part of everyday life. Long lines formed outside shops, and inflation undermined wage gains. Strikes organized by truckers and business owners disrupted distribution. What had begun as an ambitious social experiment became overshadowed by scarcity and economic turmoil. As conditions worsened, political conflict hardened into open polarization. On the streets, leftist militias patrolled alongside right-wing paramilitary groups, each accusing the other of plotting to destroy the republic. Parliament constantly challenged the president, while international attention focused on whether Chile could sustain its democratic framework under so much pressure. By 1973, the atmosphere in the country was explosive. Rumors of a coup circulated widely, and trust between political factions had nearly disappeared. On September 11, 1973, events came to a dramatic climax. The Chilean military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, launched a coup against Allende's government. Fighter jets bombed La Moneda, the presidential palace in Santiago, while tanks surrounded the streets. Allende refused to resign, delivering his final defiance as gunfire echoed outside. By the end of the day, the president was dead, and a military junta stood in control of the state. The brief but intense experiment of democratic socialism in Chile had ended, leaving behind a society fractured and a legacy that would ignite debate across the world. When the smoke cleared over Santiago in September 1973, General Augusto Pinochet emerged as the central figure in a new military junta. Although initially part of a collective leadership, Pinochet quickly sidelined the other commanders and established himself as the sole head of state. From the very beginning, the new regime suspended Congress, outlawed leftist parties, and imposed censorship. The institutions that had once defined Chile's democracy were frozen, while the army became the ultimate authority. Tanks rolled through the streets, military curfews ordered silence after dark, and a climate of fear replaced any form of open political debate. The repression that followed was systematic. Thousands of Chileans were arrested during the first weeks, and many were never seen again. Stadiums and military barracks were turned into detention centers. Torture, executions, and secret trials became tools to eliminate dissent. Some of the most notorious facilities, such as Villa Grimaldi, operated in secrecy under the control of the dreaded National Intelligence Directorate, or DINA. This organization, later replaced by the Central National Information Agency known as CNI, specialized in surveillance and counterinsurgency. Victims were often abducted in broad daylight, their families left with no answers. In the years that followed, tens of thousands went into exile, creating communities of Chileans abroad who carried the stories of repression with them. For those who remained, daily life adjusted to a climate of heavy monitoring. Trade unions were dismantled, universities brought under military oversight, and any hint of organized opposition suppressed. New laws allowed the government to declare emergencies that justified indefinite suspension of rights. Civil society, which had flourished in the decades before, retreated into silence. Yet even as citizens lived under constant surveillance, the regime forged ahead with profound economic changes that would define Chile for decades. Pinochet turned to a group of economists trained at the University of Chicago, colloquially known as the Chicago Boys. They recommended radical free market reforms intended to dismantle state intervention in the economy. Large state-owned companies were privatized. Social services such as pensions and education were gradually transferred to private institutions. Import tariffs were drastically reduced, and foreign investment openly welcomed. The result was a new economic model that contrasted sharply with the protectionism of the past. International lenders praised Chile as a pioneer of liberalization in Latin America. The cost of these reforms was borne unevenly. While businesses and foreign investors benefited from open markets, working-class Chileans faced new hardships. Unemployment surged during the initial years of adjustment, and inequality widened. Public spending cutbacks meant reduced subsidies for basic needs, and many households were forced into precarious positions. Over time, Chile's growth rates rose and industries modernized, but prosperity did not reach everyone. The divide between wealthy elites and impoverished sectors became one of the starkest in the region. To secure long-term control, Pinochet introduced a new constitution in 1980. It institutionalized military influence beyond his rule, reserving political spaces for unelected officers and limiting civilian power. With strict rules favoring continuity, the document made it exceedingly difficult to challenge the junta. Pinochet presented this as a framework for stability, but in practice, it entrenched authoritarian dominance while offering only the illusion of reform. By the late 1980s, however, pressure mounted both domestically and abroad. In 1988, Pinochet attempted to gain legitimacy through a national plebiscite, expecting voters to extend his rule. Instead, in a result that stunned observers, a majority cast ballots for no. That simple answer ended his plan for continued rule and set the stage for Chile's transition back to democracy. The military regime ended not with a sudden collapse, but with a carefully managed transition. In 1988, Chileans were asked in a national plebiscite whether General Pinochet should extend his rule for 8 more years. To the surprise of many inside and outside the country, a majority voted no. This single word marked the first serious crack in the dictatorship's hold. The following years were spent negotiating the details of a return to civilian government. By 1990, Patricio Aylwin had been elected president, becoming the first democratic leader in nearly 2 decades. His government signaled both continuity and change. The democratic system was back in place, yet the constitution written under Pinochet remained, and the military still carried significant influence. The governments that followed were dominated by the Concertación, a coalition of center-left parties ranging from socialist to Christian Democrats. For 20 years, they defined Chile's political direction. Their priority was reconciliation and stability. This meant avoiding radical upheaval while at the same time restoring trust in democratic institutions. They expanded welfare programs, invested in schools, and promoted moderate reforms to strengthen civil society. Their cautious approach reassured international investors and helped consolidate Chile's identity as one of the region's most stable democracies. Reconciling with the past was more difficult. The Aylwin administration set up the Rettig Commission in 1991 to investigate human rights violations under the dictatorship. Its report documented thousands of executions and disappearances. Later, the Valech Commission added accounts of torture and imprisonment. These reports gave official recognition to victims and families who had long been denied justice. Yet for many Chileans, the lack of trials or meaningful punishment for perpetrators was frustrating. Amnesty laws and political compromises meant that large parts of the military apparatus remained untouched, highlighting the limits of accountability during this fragile process. Economically, Chile in the 1990s entered a period of rapid growth. Copper, long the cornerstone of the nation's exports, experienced high demand in global markets. Free trade agreements expanded access to new buyers, while policies encouraging open markets and fiscal discipline attracted foreign investment. As money flowed into the state, poverty rates fell, schools and universities multiplied, healthcare services expanded, and new infrastructure projects linked distant regions. These successes allowed Chile to reduce inequality compared to the dictatorship years, although the gap between rich and poor never fully closed. Still, the democratic governments operated under an unusual constraint. Pinochet continued as commander-in-chief of the army until 1998, a constant reminder of the regime's lingering influence. Even after retiring from the armed forces, he retained the title of senator for life. His presence in politics ensured that the transition was never a complete break. Civilian leaders respected this delicate balance, knowing that pressing too aggressively for change risked reopening the wounds of conflict. In 2006, Chile experienced another historic first. Michelle Bachelet, a physician and socialist politician, became the nation's first female president. Her election held deep symbolic weight because her father, a general in the Air Force, had died under torture during the dictatorship. That personal history resonated with millions, showing how the shadows of the past continued to shape the present, even as democracy gained strength. At the beginning of the 21st century, Chile stood in a position that many of its neighbors envied. The country enjoyed steady growth, low inflation, and political stability that gave it the image of one of Latin America's strongest democracies. Copper continued to dominate exports, but new industries and global trade agreements diversified the economy, linking Chile to markets as far as Asia and Europe. International observers often praised Chile as a model of economic management in the region. Yet beneath these advances lay a different reality. Income inequality remained among the deepest in Latin America, and access to services such as healthcare, pensions, and education reflected a sharp divide between rich and poor. Many Chileans lived with the sense that while the country was wealthy, its prosperity had not been shared fairly. The first major sign of this discontent erupted in 2011 with a wave of student protests. Secondary and university students took to the streets demanding free, public, and high-quality education. For decades, education in Chile had been shaped by privatization policies introduced during the dictatorship, leaving families burdened with debt and students facing high tuition costs. The protests quickly grew larger than a debate over schools. They exposed frustration with a system where opportunities were tied closely to wealth and where promises of social mobility seemed out of reach for much of the younger generation. The demonstrations carried on for months, with marches that shut down city centers and rallies that drew wide public support. They revealed a generational demand for equality in a society still defined by structural divides. 8 years later, protests returned with a force that surprised the country and the world. In October 2019, a small hike in Santiago's subway fare sparked anger among commuters. Within days, the issue spread beyond transportation. People from every background joined demonstrations, declaring that the fare increase was a symbol of broader inequalities embedded in daily life. Millions participated in marches across the country, voicing demands for changes in pensions, wages, healthcare, and education. Clashes with police, curfews, and states of emergency showed how seriously the government viewed the challenge. Still, the sheer scale of the movement gave it unprecedented power. The central demand that emerged was clear: replace the constitution drafted under the Pinochet regime in 1980. For many, this document represented the backbone of Chile's inequality, constraining social reforms and cementing a market-driven model. Calls for a new founding charter gained overwhelming momentum, and by 2020, a national referendum had approved the idea with a large majority. In 2021, Chile held elections for a constitutional convention unlike any other in the world. It was the first assembly of its kind to guarantee gender parity and include representatives from indigenous communities. The process attracted global attention, promising a progressive and inclusive framework for change. Yet in 2022, the proposed draft was rejected by voters, signaling how divided Chilean society remained. The rejection did not end the process, but reset it, sparking renewed efforts to propose alternatives that balance reform with tradition. While the debate over the Constitution continues, Chile plays an increasingly central role in global markets for a different reason: lithium. Found in the salt flats of the north, Chile's reserves are among the largest in the world. With the rise of electric cars and renewable energy storage, lithium has become a strategic resource, positioning Chile as a key actor in the transition to a green global economy. During the 2019 protests, a song from the past re-emerged. Victor Jara's "The Right to Live in Peace," silenced after his murder in 1973, was sung by crowds in plazas and streets. It symbolized a bridge between generations, linking the memory of dictatorship with new struggles for dignity and justice in today's Chile. Chile's history is one of collapse and renewal, shaped by natural boundaries and social upheaval. From independence struggles to today's demands for equality, every turning point blends conflict with reconstruction. Mountains, deserts, and ocean forged resilience but never prevented instability. Now, protests and constitutional debates show the nation's story remains unfinished. Self-determination contested, rewritten, and pursued by each generation.